The 1960s gave us some of the most legendary cars ever built. Muscle machines, sleek sports cars, and stylish cruisers that still make hearts race today. But not every car from that golden decade was a masterpiece. Some were underpowered embarrassments, cheaply built rust buckets, or just plain awful ideas that failed miserably. These are the forgotten flops that prove even in the greatest era of motoring, disasters still rolled off the assembly line. Today, we're digging into the 12 worst and crappy cars from the 1960s in the world. Ugly mistakes, mechanical nightmares, and failures that deserve to be remembered for all the wrong reasons. Watch till the end, and don't forget to subscribe.
The 1969 Subaru 360 is one of those strange little cars that perfectly illustrates how something that worked in one country could completely fail in another. In Japan, the 360 was considered a pioneer of the K-car movement, a segment of ultra-compact vehicles designed to be affordable, fuel-efficient, and easy to maneuver through narrow post-war streets. It was Japan's people's car, cheap enough for families to own and simple enough for small garages to maintain. But when it was exported to the United States by Malcolm Bricklin, the same man who later brought us the infamous Bricklin SV1 and helped launch the Yugo here, the 360 became one of the most ridiculed and outright rejected imports in American automotive history. On paper, the car seemed appealing. The sticker price was under $1,300, making it the cheapest new car in America at the time. Subaru's ads called it cheap and cheerful, pitching it as a practical runabout for budget-conscious families, college students, or even as a second car. Its tiny two-stroke 356cc twin-cylinder engine was rated at just 25 horsepower, giving the little car a theoretical top speed of about 60 miles per hour, if you had enough patience and a long enough road. The featherweight body meant it was astonishingly fuel-efficient, often getting 60 miles per gallon. In Japan, those qualities made it beloved. In America, they made it a sitting duck. Almost immediately, problems began. U.S. highways in 1969 were full of huge V8-powered land yachts, cars that could cruise all day at 75 miles per hour without breaking a sweat. By comparison, the Subaru 360 was terrifyingly slow, taking over 30 seconds to reach 50 miles per hour. Merging onto an interstate was a white-knuckle experience, and being passed by semi-trucks was more like surviving a near-death encounter than a routine commute. Crash safety was essentially non-existent. The car weighed under 1,000 pounds, had no meaningful crumple zones, and its paper-thin steel panels offered about as much protection as a soda can. The coup de grace came when Consumer Reports tested the Subaru 360 in 1969 and gave it one of the harshest reviews in the magazine's history. They declared it unacceptable as transportation for American roads, citing poor acceleration, dangerous handling, and virtually no crash protection. The magazine even implied that buyers were risking their lives if they attempted to use it as a serious automobile. The review effectively killed any chance Subaru had of selling the 360 in meaningful numbers in the United States. Owners who did take a gamble on the 360 often found it quirky and amusing in a novelty sense, but infuriating as an actual daily driver. The tiny two-stroke engine required frequent maintenance and produced a constant cloud of oily smoke from the exhaust. Hills were a nightmare. The car would bog down to bicycle speeds if asked to climb anything steep. Many complained about the laughably thin tires, which wore out quickly and made handling unpredictable in wet conditions. Others joked that driving one was like riding inside a sewing machine with wheels. Dealers, too, struggled to make the car appealing. Some tried to emphasize its fuel efficiency, others played up the cute factor, even comparing it to Volkswagen's Beetle. But the Beetle, though small by American standards, at least had decent build quality, respectable safety for its era, and enough power to keep up with traffic. The Subaru 360 simply couldn't compete. By 1971, Subaru quietly pulled the plug on U.S. sales of the 360. Fewer than 10,000 were sold, and many of those ended up abandoned in backyards, relegated to novelty status, or cannibalized for parts. For decades, the 360 was remembered in America as one of the worst cars ever offered, a punchline in the history of imports. Ironically, the 360's failure in the US did not doom Subaru as a company. They quickly shifted strategies, developing larger, sturdier vehicles like the Subaru Leon, which laid the foundation for the brand's reputation for quirky, practical, and rugged cars. Today, Subaru is a household name in America, known for Outbacks and all-wheel drive reliability. The 360, however, remains a cautionary tale, a car perfectly suited for one market, but completely unsuited for another. Survivors today are rare, but collectible in a niche sense, often treasured by microcar enthusiasts who appreciate its historical significance. At car shows, a Subaru 360 will draw crowds for its sheer oddity, with people marveling at how tiny it looks next to modern vehicles. But for anyone who remembers its short-lived American career, it remains a rolling reminder of just how badly a car can miss the mark when dropped into the wrong environment. Would you like me to expand this even further with direct owner quotes from period road tests and anecdotes from those who actually tried to daily drive one in the late 1960s?
The 1968 Trabant 601 is one of those machines that became more than just a car. It became a symbol, both to the people who owned it and to the world that judged it. To East Germans, it was freedom of a kind, the only way to get from one town to another without relying on state buses or bicycles. To Westerners, it was a joke, a rolling piece of communist irony, proof that a closed economy could build a car and yet somehow miss every definition of what a car should be by modern standards. Introduced in 1964 and continuing largely unchanged through 1990, the Trabant 601 was already obsolete when it debuted. Its boxy body was made not of steel, but of a composite material called Duroplast, essentially plastic reinforced with cotton fibers. East German engineers chose it because steel was scarce and expensive, but Duroplast was brittle, hard to recycle, and had a reputation for shattering in accidents. This gave rise to the Western stereotype that a Trabant was made of cardboard or plastic toy parts. In reality, the shell could take small dings without rusting, but in a serious crash, it offered virtually no protection. Drivers joke that if you got hit by a big Mercedes, the only thing the police would find intact was your license plate. Under the hood sat a 594cc two-cylinder, two-stroke engine puffing out 26 horsepower and an oily blue smoke trail that became the Trabant's signature. The sound was like a chainsaw mixed with a moped, and the smell, an acrid blend of gasoline and burned oil, was impossible to forget. Top speed was just under 65 miles an hour, but getting there was an act of patience, and climbing hills often meant dropping into the right lane and crawling as West German Opels and BMWs sped past. The gearbox was a crude 4-speed with no synchromesh on first, so grinding gears was simply part of ownership. Inside, the Trabant was as bare as a car could be. Vinyl seats, a thin plastic dashboard, and almost no insulation meant noise filled the cabin. And in winter, the heater barely kept the frost off the windshield. Comfort wasn't even a consideration. This was transportation reduced to its absolute minimum. The suspension, with its primitive leaf springs, gave the ride all the softness of a horse-drawn wagon. Owners frequently said that after a few hours on an East German road, your spine felt as if you'd been driving a tractor. And yet, for all its flaws, the Trabant 601 held deep meaning in the East. Getting one wasn't a matter of walking into a dealership. It required applying, saving, and waiting, sometimes for over a decade. Families placed their order when a child was born, knowing they might not take delivery until that child was in high school. By the time you finally got your car, it wasn't just a machine, it was proof of perseverance. For many East Germans, the Trabant was their first taste of independence, their way to take a holiday trip to the Baltic Sea or to visit relatives in another district. Western journalists who drove it in the 1960s and 70s were merciless. Road testers compared it to driving a glorified lawnmower, mocking its performance, its smell, and its shoddy build quality.
One British journalist described it as a car that feels like it was designed by people who have only seen cars in photographs. American visitors to East Germany would often laugh at the Trabant, treating it as a joke, a toy car that somehow made it onto real roads. It became the butt of countless jokes. Why does a Trabant have a heated rear window? To keep your hands warm while you push it. But what those Western critics often missed was that the Trabant wasn't meant to compete with Volkswagens or Fords. It was a product of its system, cheap, simple, and built from whatever materials the state could muster. In that sense, it succeeded. It kept millions of East Germans mobile, with over 3 million built during its long production run. The problem was that it never evolved. By the late 1960s, the Trabant was already outdated. By the 1980s, it was a rolling relic from another era, still belching smoke while the rest of Europe had moved on to clean, efficient, modern cars. The Trabant became infamous worldwide in 1989 during the fall of the Berlin Wall, when East Germans drove thousands of them across into the West. Suddenly, the streets of Berlin, Munich, and Frankfurt were filled with smoky little plastic cars sputtering alongside gleaming Mercedes-Benzes and Audis. The image was unforgettable. A car that symbolized everything East Germans had endured, now rolling into the free world as their drivers sought a better life. Many Western Germans saw the Trabant as laughable. But for those who had waited years to own one, it was a symbol of survival and resilience. Today, the Trabant 601 lives in museums, car clubs, and tourist fleets. In Berlin, visitors can actually rent Trabants for Trabi safaris, driving in convoys through the city while choking on the nostalgic smell of two-stroke exhaust. Collectors treat them as curiosities, not for their performance or engineering, but for their cultural meaning. They are reminders of how cars are more than machines. They can become icons of an entire political system, for better or worse. Would you like me to make the story even longer by weaving in first-hand anecdotes from both East German owners who adored their Trabis and Westerners who saw them as absurd relics?
The 1967 Chevrolet Corvair, part of the second generation that had been introduced in 1965, is one of the more tragic stories in American automotive history because it wasn't simply a bad car in the conventional sense. It was a car that carried the weight of a reputation it could never shake off, no matter how much Chevrolet improved it. The first generation Corvair, launched in 1960, had been daringly different, featuring a rear-mounted, air-cooled flat-six engine and swing-axle suspension, which gave it a quirky European feel in a market dominated by heavy, front-engine Detroit iron. But Ralph Nader's 1965 book, Unsafe at Any Speed, singled out the early Corvair's handling quirks, particularly its tendency towards snap oversteer, and painted it as an emblem of corporate negligence and disregard for consumer safety. By the time the second generation rolled out, the damage was already done. The 1967 model year in particular should have been a turning point. Chevrolet had already addressed the suspension problems by switching to a far more sophisticated, fully independent rear suspension derived from the Corvette Stingray, which made the car much more predictable and balanced. Enthusiasts who actually drove the later Corvairs often said that they were among the best-handling American cars of the 1960s, nimble in corners and surprisingly modern-feeling compared to their bloated contemporaries. Car and Driver even praised it as an American Porsche for a fraction of the price. But the stigma remained. In the public's mind, a Corvair was a lawsuit on wheels, a death trap in sheet metal. Nader's name and the cars were forever linked. The 1967 version also suffered from timing. By then, the pony car revolution was in full swing. Chevrolet's own Camaro had just been introduced, and it instantly captured the youth market that the Corvair had once flirted with. Why buy a Corvair when you could buy a Camaro with a throaty V8, aggressive styling, and none of the baggage? Even Chevrolet dealers began steering customers away from the Corvair, seeing it as a liability. One dealer was quoted in a local paper saying, "We don't push the Corvair anymore. Why invite trouble?" The car quickly became known as the one Chevy on the lot the salesman wouldn't want to talk about. To make matters worse, resale values collapsed. Used Corvairs were seen as tainted goods, hard to insure and harder to trade in. Families who had bought them new suddenly found themselves stuck with cars that the neighbors whispered about. One Ohio owner recalled that every time she parked her '67 Corvair outside the grocery store, people would ask her, "Aren't you afraid of driving that thing? Didn't you read Nader's book?" She admitted that she loved the way it drove, but the constant questions made her feel embarrassed to own it. Mechanically, the car had its quirks, but was not inherently worse than many of its contemporaries. The air-cooled flat six was unusual, producing a distinctive, whirring exhaust note that enthusiasts found charming, and the 140 horsepower and turbocharged versions could be lively. The handling, with the updated suspension, was genuinely good, especially compared to softly sprung Detroit sedans of the era. But all of that was overshadowed by the specter of lawsuits, the jokes in late-night comedy, and the growing awareness that Chevrolet itself had quietly abandoned the car. By 1967, the company was putting almost no marketing behind it. The message was clear: the Camaro was the future, and the Corvair was a problem best forgotten. Owners often felt like they were defending an underdog. Many later praised the car as misunderstood. Some enthusiasts even took pride in owning what Nader had condemned, as if to say they weren't swayed by fear-mongering. But the mainstream buyer didn't want controversy parked in their driveway. As one contemporary ad man put it, the Corvair was the car you bought only if you wanted your neighbors to think you had a death wish. Today, the 1967 Corvair stands as a bittersweet reminder of how reputation can kill a car faster than engineering can save it. It wasn't unsafe by that point, it was simply unwanted. Production numbers dwindled, sales collapsed, and by 1969, the Corvair was quietly discontinued with little fanfare. Chevrolet barely acknowledged its passing, as if ashamed of having built it at all. And yet for those who still drive them today, especially the later models, the Corvair is remembered as a stylish, fun-to-drive car that was condemned not by its flaws, but by the weight of its legacy.
The 1966 Sunbeam Alpine Series 5 was a perfect example of how a car can look the part of a sporty, glamorous roadster, yet fail to deliver on the promise once you slid behind the wheel. Built by the Roots Group of Britain and imported into the US as an affordable alternative to MGs and Triumphs, the Alpine had the styling cues that seemed just right for the mid-1960s sports car market. It had the long hood, short deck, wire wheels, and low-slung stance that evoked images of European sophistication. To the casual observer, it looked every bit the equal of an MGB or a Triumph TR4. But appearances can be cruelly deceiving, and the Alpine quickly revealed itself as more show than go. The Series 5 was the final iteration of the Alpine line, and by the time it arrived in 1965, Roots engineers were scrambling to keep it relevant. Under the hood sat a 1.7-liter four-cylinder producing just 92 horsepower, an improvement over earlier versions, but still anemic by sports car standards of the day. On paper, it was tolerable, but in practice, it was a letdown. Acceleration from 0 to 60 miles per hour took nearly 13 seconds, a figure that looked downright embarrassing next to the more spirited Triumphs, MGs, and especially the car's own V8-powered sibling, the Sunbeam Tiger. Contemporary testers called it adequate if you're patient and a sports car only by silhouette. Owners remembered having to floor the gas just to keep up with freeway traffic, and one American driver later quipped, "It looked like James Bond's weekend car, but drove like his secretary's commuter." The car was also heavier than it appeared, tipping the scales at over 2,300 pounds, chunky for a four-cylinder British roadster. That extra weight blunted performance further and left the Alpine feeling sluggish on twisty roads where its rivals danced with ease. Handling was safe, but uninspired, more cruiser than corner carver. Drivers expecting a nimble European sports machine were greeted instead with what felt like a compact convertible that had been styled for flair, but engineered with little urgency. Build quality was another Achilles heel. Roots was already struggling financially, and the Alpine bore the marks of cost-cutting. Interiors rattled and trim pieces came loose even on nearly new cars. Electrical systems were notoriously temperamental, with Lucas components earning their infamous Prince of Darkness nickname all over again. Owners complained of headlights cutting out, dashboards buzzing, and switches failing without warning. Rust protection was almost non-existent, and many Alpines began to rot from the sills and wheel wells after only a few winters on American roads. One disillusioned owner summed it up bluntly. It was like buying a shiny toy that started breaking as soon as you took it out of the box. The biggest problem for the Alpine Series 5, however, was the Tiger. Roots had contracted Carroll Shelby to stuff Ford's small block V8 into the Alpine shell, creating the Sunbeam Tiger, a fire-breathing little roadster with genuine performance credibility. The Tiger became an instant legend, while the standard Alpine looked hopelessly outclassed sitting beside it in the same showroom. Buyers would peer at the Alpine, nod politely, and then point to the Tiger and asking, "Can I have that one instead?" For those who ended up with the four-cylinder Alpine, it was hard not to feel like you had bought the costume version of the real car. Sales reflected this disappointment. The Series 5 did not sell well in the United States despite the growing hunger for affordable sports cars. Roots dealers often had to discount them heavily, and in some cases even threw in extras like luggage racks or radios just to move inventory. A former dealer in California remembered, "If we had Tiger in stock, the Alpine just sat there looking like a wallflower at the dance." By 1967, Chrysler had taken control of Roots, and the Alpine faded quietly into obscurity as the British sports car market shifted towards newer, more exciting models. Today, the Alpine Series 5 is remembered mostly as the Tiger's weaker twin, a car that could never escape the shadow of its V8 sibling. Enthusiasts who own them often recall them with a kind of fond exasperation. Pretty to look at, pleasant to cruise in on a summer day, but frustrating when judged against the expectations its looks inspired. Some have compared owning one to dating someone stunning who never really wanted to dance. Would you like me to go even deeper by weaving in some stories from owners who bought the Alpine only because they couldn't afford the Tiger, and how that shaped their feelings about the car over the years?
The 1965 Simco 1000 was France's attempt at creating a practical, modern compact that could compete not just in Europe, but also abroad, including the fiercely competitive US market. On paper, it seemed to fit the formula of the day: a small, economical family sedan with room for four, light enough to sip fuel, and simple enough to appeal to working-class buyers. But in practice, it became a textbook example of a car that looked outdated almost as soon as it appeared. And in the US, it turned into one of the shortest-lived imports of its era. The Simco 1000 was built around a rear-engine, rear-wheel drive layout, an approach that was already losing ground in the mid-1960s, as front-engine, front-wheel drive compacts like the Mini and more refined small sedans from Renault and Fiat began proving their worth. The rear-engine setup gave the Simca an odd balance, with too much weight over the tail and a tendency toward unpredictable handling when pushed. Contemporary reviewers noted heavy understeer in everyday driving that could suddenly flip into abrupt oversteer if you lifted off the throttle in a corner. In other words, it wasn't so much fun as it was fidgety. One American road tester joked that it handled like a washing machine walking across the floor. Power was another issue. The base engine was a 944cc four-cylinder, producing just over 40 horsepower. And while that might have been sufficient for narrow European city streets, it was hopelessly inadequate for the wide-open highways of the United States. The top speed hovered around 70 miles per hour, but getting there was a noisy, drawn-out process accompanied by a mechanical thrash that drivers described as like a sewing machine with indigestion.
Acceleration was leisurely to the point of frustration. Merging onto an American freeway in a Simco 1000 was more prayer than performance. Styling didn't help its case. The Simco 1000 had a boxy, slab-sided look that was utilitarian rather than charming. Unlike the Volkswagen Beetle, which had managed to turn its odd shape into an icon, the Simca looked anonymous at best and awkward at worst. The upright greenhouse and stubby proportions gave it the appearance of an appliance rather than a desirable car. One American buyer later recalled, "It looked like a Renault that someone had left in the sun too long, and it shrank." Build quality was also a recurring sore spot. Many U.S. owners complained about flimsy trim, rattling dashboards, and switches that broke off in their hands. Mechanical reliability was poor, with overheating, weak electrical components, and failing carburetors among the most common headaches. Dealers, already sparse, struggled to stock parts, which meant long waits for even basic repairs. By the time an owner got their Simca back on the road, many had already sworn off ever buying another. One frustrated Californian wrote in a letter to an automotive magazine, "I bought it to save money on gas, but every penny went to the mechanic. It was a slow-motion disaster." In Europe, the Simca 1000 at least had some presence, especially in its home market of France and in Spain, where it was assembled under license. But even there, it was quickly overshadowed by Renault's far more competent Doofine and later Renault 8, as well as Citroën's quirky but practical 2CV and Ami. The Simca ended up appealing mostly to buyers who wanted the cheapest possible new car, not to those looking for style or performance. And in the US, where buyers demanded more comfort, durability, and power from even small imports, the Simca 1000 never had a chance. Sales figures were minuscule, and most dealers dropped it from their lineup almost immediately after realizing that customers weren't interested. Today, the Simca 1000 is remembered more for its failures than its achievements. In France, it does have a curious afterlife thanks to enthusiasts who turned them into amateur rally cars. Proof that with extensive modifications, the lightweight chassis could actually be entertaining. But in America, the few that were sold disappeared almost entirely within a decade, rusting away or being scrapped when parts ran dry. Spotting one at a classic car show today is so rare that it usually draws puzzled stares rather than admiration. For many former owners, the memory of the Simca 1000 is one of regret mixed with a little humor. It was noisy, it was slow, it was fragile, and in the US, it was a total flop. One owner probably summed it up best when he said, "It wasn't a lemon. Lemons have more juice." Do you want me to expand further into how Chrysler's ownership of Simca later complicated its US reputation, since Chrysler tried to use Simca as its European arm, but ended up importing cars Americans wanted even less?
It's like something you'd commute in, and more like something you'd pull out of a Christmas stocking. Its design was absurdly minimalist. It had 3 wheels, a single door on the left-hand side, 1 windshield wiper, and 1 tiny headlight. The interior consisted of a seat for 1 adult, just 1, with enough space for a grocery bag or a briefcase behind them. Power came from a 49cc DKW scooter engines, but at that speed, the car rattled so much that drivers felt they were about to shake the entire vehicle apart. Because of its tiny size and featherweight construction, it was heavily buffeted by wind and vulnerable to potholes. One owner joked, "If you hit a manhole cover wrong, you'd change lanes." Another recalled the trucks passing on the highway created such a vacuum effect that the P50 was practically sucked sideways, making every journey nerve-wracking. Comfort was non-existent.
With no suspension to speak of, the ride was bone-jarring, and the seat was little more than a padded bench bolted to the shell. Noise advertising at the time even boasted that it was cheaper than walking, though that was only barely true, since its cost of £199, about $450 in 1964, wasn't insignificant compared to the reliability and practicality of a used Mini. Unsurprisingly, Peele sold very few. Fewer than 50 units were produced in the original run from 1962 to 1965, and not all of them survived. By the time it reached the motoring press, most reviewers treated it as a novelty rather than a serious automobile. The BBC's Top Gear later famously featured it, with Jeremy Clarkson driving one inside the BBC offices, which captured perfectly the absurdity of using it in everyday life. Clarkson described it as the worst car ever built if you want to live, but also admitted that it was so bizarre that it had a certain irresistible charm. Despite its impracticality, or maybe because of it, the Peele P50 has gained an enormous cult following among collectors of microcars and oddball vehicles. Today, surviving originals fetch staggering sums at auction, often over $100,000, making them some of the most valuable cheap cars ever made. Replica versions are also being produced, some even updated with electric powertrains, ensuring that the legend of the world's tiniest car lives on. Former owners often describe the experience of driving one as equal parts terror and comedy. One summed it up perfectly. It wasn't a car, it was a punchline on wheels, but I'll never forget the look on people's faces when I drove it down the street. Would you like me to also cover the even rarer Peele Trident, the bubble-roofed two-seater that was somehow even stranger than the P50?
The 1963 Hillman Imp was Roots Group's ambitious but deeply flawed answer to the wildly successful Mini. When the Mini burst onto the scene in 1959, it rewrote the small car rulebook with its transverse front-engine layout, front-wheel drive, and astonishing packaging efficiency. Roots wanted their own competitor, but instead of following the Mini's formula, they chose to reinvent the wheel, quite literally, by designing a rear-engine, rear-wheel drive car that ended up plagued with issues from day one. The Imp had a lot of promise on paper. It was compact, light, and featured some advanced engineering touches. Its aluminum 875cc engine was derived from a Coventry Climax unit originally designed for fire pumps, which gave it a revvy, sporty character that should have made it a delight to drive. The rear-mounted engine allowed for a low nose, giving the Imp good aerodynamics and excellent forward visibility. It even had an opening rear window hatch, which made loading groceries easier than most small cars of the time, a clever feature that predated the widespread use of hatchbacks. At launch, Roots marketed it as a mini beater with superior comfort, better refinement, and a more advanced design. But then reality hit. The aluminum engine, while technically impressive, was prone to overheating because the cooling system was poorly designed and often failed under everyday use. Owners quickly learned that the Imp's radiator placement and weak water pump couldn't keep temperatures stable, especially in traffic. Head gaskets were notorious for blowing, and many owners recalled carrying spare jugs of water just to keep the thing alive on longer journeys. On top of that, the car's rear engine made it tail-happy and tricky to control, particularly for inexperienced drivers. The build quality was another disaster. Early cars were assembled at a brand new factory in Linwood, Scotland, which had inexperienced workers and constant labor disputes. Poor assembly meant that electrics often failed, trim rattled from new, and dealers struggled to keep up with warranty claims. Many buyers who switched from a reliable Morris Minor or a sturdy Ford Anglia felt they had stepped into a car that seemed eager to strand them by the roadside. One disgruntled owner summed it up by saying, "I didn't drive an Imp, I nursed it." Despite its troubles, the Imp did have some charms. The engine, when working, was lively and eager, giving the lightweight car surprisingly spirited acceleration for its size. It handled well on smooth roads at moderate speeds, and its ride comfort was better than the stiffly sprung Mini.
But these positives were drowned out by the constant breakdowns and poor reputation that spread quickly. In export markets, especially the US and Canada, the Imp sold poorly. Americans already skeptical of tiny British imports found it intolerable compared to the far more robust and charming Mini. Culturally, the Imp became a sort of cautionary tale of British car making in the 1960s. Instead of delivering on its promise to rival the Mini, it turned into yet another example of overambitious engineering undone by underfunded execution. Roots lost huge amounts of money on the project, and the factory at Linwood never recovered, eventually dragging the whole company further into decline until Chrysler bought them out. Owners who stuck with their Imps often grew oddly fond of them, treating them like quirky pets rather than dependable machines. One longtime owner later joked, "Every time I fixed mine, I felt like I'd achieved something great. The problem was, I had to achieve greatness at least once a week." Today, surviving Imps are niche collector cars, appreciated for their quirks and their underdog story rather than their reliability. Enthusiasts point out that when properly restored and maintained, they can actually be enjoyable classics with a lot of character. But in their day, the 1963 Hillman Imp was a clear flop, an ambitious idea executed badly, remembered more for its failures than its innovations. Would you like me to also go into the later sportier versions, like the Imp GT and the rally-bred Sunbeam Imp, which actually showed what the platform could have been if Roots had gotten it right from the start?
The 1962 Dodge Dart was one of Chrysler's most infamous missteps of the early 60s, a car that showed just how badly panic and poor planning could cripple a brand's momentum. To understand the Dart's downfall, you have to look at the corporate chaos Chrysler was in at the time. By 1960, the Big Three were all scrambling to answer a growing threat from compact imports like the Volkswagen Beetle and domestic newcomers like the Ford Falcon and Chevy Corvair. Dodge, which had always positioned itself as a middle-market brand above Plymouth, suddenly found itself under pressure to produce a compact of its own. The result was a frantic downsizing of the Dart for 1962, and the outcome was disastrous. Previously, the Dart name had been attached to Dodge's full-size cars, handsome, roomy, traditional family sedans. But in 1962, Chrysler's new president, Lynn Townsend, insisted that Dodge needed a smaller, lighter car to fight the Falcon and Chevy 2 head-on. Designers and engineers were forced to shrink the Dart onto a smaller wheelbase, repackage it awkwardly, and push it out the door in a matter of months. The result was a car that didn't know what it wanted to be. At 116 inches of wheelbase, the 1962 Dart was too big to be a true compact, yet too small to satisfy traditional Dodge buyers who expected full-size space. It fell into a no-man's land between compact and mid-size, a market segment that didn't really exist yet, and buyers were confused. Styling didn't help. The 1962 Dart was a product of Chrysler's forward-look hangover, with slabby body sides, strange proportions, and awkwardly shrunken sheet metal that looked pinched and cheap compared to Chevrolet's clean, balanced Chevy 2. The roofline was ungainly, the overhangs looked stubby, and the detailing lacked the elegance Dodge buyers were used to. One automotive journalist at the time called it a car that looks like it shrank in the wash, while a Dodge dealer in Ohio quipped, "We couldn't give them away unless someone needed a second car for the dog." The interior was no better. In downsizing, Dodge stripped out the comfort and space that had made the Dart appealing just a year ago. Legroom and trunk space were compromised, yet it wasn't small enough to call it a true compact. The marketing made it worse. Dodge insisted on selling the Dart as a family car, but families quickly discovered it was neither roomy enough nor stylish enough to compete with GM and Ford offerings. Buyers who wanted a cheap runabout simply bought a Falcon or a Chevy 2, while loyal Dodge customers felt betrayed that their once proud Dart had been reduced to an awkwardly shrunken oddball. Performance also fell flat. While Dodge offered slant-six engines and small V8s, the car's weight distribution and awkward dimensions meant it never felt lively.
Road testers complained of vague steering, poor balance, and a generally tinny driving feel compared to the solid Ford and Chevy competition. Reliability was decent thanks to Chrysler's rugged drivetrains, but by then, the damage to Dodge's reputation was already done. Sales tanked almost immediately. Instead of winning over compact buyers, the 1962 Dart alienated Dodge's core market and confused everyone else. Chrysler scrambled to salvage the mess by introducing the mid-sized Dodge 330, 440, and Polara 500 later in the same year, and repositioning the Dart nameplate once again in 1963 as a true compact on the A-body platform, where it finally found lasting success. But the damage lingered. Dodge dealers spent months stuck with unsold 62 Darts, often resorting to deep discounts or fleet sales just to move inventory. Owners who did buy the 1962 Dart often expressed regret. Many remembered it as a compromise car that never lived up to Dodge's reputation. One period owner recalled, "It wasn't small enough to save gas, it wasn't big enough to haul the family, and it sure wasn't pretty enough to make me proud. I traded it after a year and never looked back." In hindsight, the 1962 Dodge Dart stands as a textbook example of Chrysler's early 60s mismanagement. It was a car nobody really asked for, built out of panic rather than vision, and marketed into a segment that didn't really exist. While the Dart name would go on to enjoy a long and respected run later in the 60s and 70s as one of America's most dependable compacts, the 1962 model remains the embarrassing outlier, a lost Dart that missed the target so badly, Dodge had to reinvent the name almost immediately. Would you like me to go into detail about how Dodge salvaged the Dart name in 1963 and how the A-body redesign completely changed its reputation after the 62 disaster?
The 1961 Amphar Model 770 was one of the most unusual automotive experiments ever imported into the United States, a car designed to literally drive into water and float away. Its concept was undeniably fun on paper, a dual-purpose vehicle that could take you from city streets straight into a lake or river without ever leaving the driver's seat. But while the idea captured imaginations, the execution left much to be desired. Mechanically, the Amphar was based on a modest German-built chassis and powered by a 1147cc four-cylinder engine producing just 43 horsepower. On land, this was painfully underpowered. The car's top speed barely reached 70 miles per hour, and acceleration was lethargic, especially with two passengers aboard. Its handling was compromised by the need to keep the body buoyant. The suspension was soft and the ride floaty, giving the impression that you were driving on jelly rather than asphalt. Steering was vague, braking was weak, and crosswinds could make it feel unstable. Owners quickly realized that while it could technically drive like a regular car, it was far from enjoyable or practical for everyday use. In water, the Amphar was equally compromised. Propulsion came from a pair of rear-mounted propellers connected to the drivetrain, allowing the car to reach about 7 knots, roughly 8 miles per hour. While impressive in concept, the slow speed meant that crossing a small lake could feel like an eternity, and waves quickly destabilized the vehicle. Water often seeped into the cabin, particularly through the doors, and corrosion became a constant headache. Owners had to be vigilant about keeping the hull sealed and the mechanical components clean and lubricated, making the Amphar far more labor-intensive than a conventional boat. One early owner reportedly joked, "It's like owning a car that sulks in the water and a boat that sulks on land." Practicality was another huge issue. The Amphar seated only 4, with cramped interior space, minimal luggage capacity, and a soft top that offered poor protection from sun, rain, or wind. Maintenance was a nightmare, parts were scarce, and the dual-purpose drivetrain meant that every repair required specialized knowledge of both automotive and marine systems. The car was also expensive, far more costly than a standard compact car or a small boat, which limited its potential market to wealthy enthusiasts willing to tolerate constant headaches for novelty value.
Despite these flaws, the Amphar did attract attention and even celebrity ownership. Its marketing emphasized freedom, adventure, and uniqueness, positioning it as the ultimate leisure vehicle for lakeside living. But for most owners, it quickly became a high-maintenance toy. Dealers found that customers who were serious about boating usually preferred a real boat, and those who needed a daily driver found the Amphar slow, unwieldy, and unreliable. Culturally, the Amphar has endured as a quirky symbol of 1960s optimism and experimental engineering, a vehicle that defied convention and dared to be utterly impractical. Collectors today prize it for its novelty and ingenuity, but contemporary owners often describe it as fun in short bursts, frustrating the rest of the time. One dedicated enthusiast summed it up, "Driving it on land makes you miss a real car. Driving it in water makes you miss a real boat. But when it works, you smile like a fool." In the end, only about 4,000 Amphar Model 770s were ever built, and many of them quickly fell into disrepair. The car-boat hybrid concept was never successfully replicated, leaving the Amphar as a singular, infamous curiosity, a dream on paper that proved far too quirky for practical life. Its legacy is one of charm and frustration in equal measure, an icon of ambition outstripping execution.
The 1961 Pontiac Tempest Slant 4 stands as one of General Motors' most fascinating, if flawed, experiments in compact car engineering. A model that attempted to blend innovation, efficiency, and cost-cutting, yet ended up as a lesson in ambition outpacing practical execution. GM, watching the rising popularity of small, efficient cars from Europe and Japan, wanted a domestic answer, a car that could compete with imports without completely abandoning the Pontiac brand's identity for style and comfort. The Tempest platform itself was a fresh approach, with a unibody design and a unique torque tube rear drive system intended to provide better weight distribution and smoother handling than most American compacts of the era. It even featured independent front suspension, giving the car a ride quality superior to many contemporaries. On paper, the vehicle seemed a clever compromise, small enough for efficiency, light enough for decent handling, and backed by Pontiac's reputation, but the engine choice would undo much of its promise. The centerpiece, and the Achilles heel, was the so-called Slant 4 engine. GM engineers took the 389 cubic inch Pontiac V8, essentially a hallmark of power and smoothness, and sliced it down to a 4-cylinder inline unit, sharing the same bore and stroke dimensions. It was mounted at a noticeable slant in the engine bay to allow a lower hood line and improve weight distribution. The concept seemed brilliant in theory, a lightweight, compact engine with familiar internal geometry that could be produced using existing tooling, reducing costs. Unfortunately, the reality was far less elegant. From the very first ignition, the Slant 4 vibrated relentlessly. Unlike a conventional 4-cylinder, which relies on balanced shafts and carefully timed counterweights, the Slant 4 had an inherently lopsided design due to being a Haft V8. Drivers quickly discovered that the vibrations were not just annoying, they transmitted through the floor, the seats, the steering column, even the radio buzzed in resonance with the engine. A family driving on long stretches of highway often complained of fatigue, headaches, and the persistent feeling of being shaken apart. The vibrations also exacerbated wear on engine mounts and peripheral components, leading to rattles, leaks, and faster than normal deterioration of connected systems. The engine's durability problems were equally notorious. The crankshaft, under normal driving conditions, was prone to stress fractures and catastrophic failure, leaving owners stranded or forced into expensive repairs. Early marketing glossed over these issues, emphasizing the novelty and efficiency of the slanted layout, but in practice, owners had to constantly inspect and maintain the engine to avoid complete breakdowns. The exhaust note, meanwhile, was rough and metallic, a harsh, almost industrial rasp that felt out of place in a car meant to carry families in comfort. Enthusiasts often joked that the Slant 4 sounded like a lawnmower fused to a jackhammer, which only added to its odd reputation. Despite the engine's glaring flaws, the rest of the Tempest was well engineered. The rear-mounted torque tube contributed to unusual but stable handling, particularly for a compact American car, while the independent front suspension gave a ride quality superior to many mid-sized sedans. The interior was comfortable for its size, with well-placed controls and decent ergonomics, while the compact dimensions made it surprisingly maneuverable in urban settings. Yet these positive attributes were consistently overshadowed by the engine's shortcomings, creating a paradox: a car that handled well and had potential, but was perpetually undermined by its heart. Sales were modest. Some buyers appreciated the novelty and unique engineering, seeing it as an adventurous, forward-thinking compact that offered more sophistication than the domestic competition. Others were horrified by the constant vibration, mechanical fragility, and peculiar driving dynamics, returning to traditional Pontiac or Chevrolet models instead. The Slant 4, despite its clever conception, became a cautionary tale within GM. Innovation without thorough testing can result in widespread customer dissatisfaction and mechanical headaches. Eventually, GM abandoned the engine entirely. By the mid-1960s, conventional 4- and 6-cylinder engines replaced the experimental Slant 4 in Pontiac compacts, providing far more reliable power and refinement. Collectors today often view the Tempest Slant 4 as a unique curiosity, a car that demonstrated both bold engineering ambition and the risks of unconventional solutions. Its legacy is one of contrast, a car praised for handling, comfort, and compact design, yet cursed by an engine that vibrated, cracked, and sounded like a machine barely tamed. Owners' memories of the car are telling. One recalled, "On the road, it was a neat little car. Everything felt precise except for that engine. You could feel it in your bones. I loved driving it, but I also feared every mile would be my last without a broken crankshaft." Another mused, "It was like GM tried to invent a new category of engine, but forgot people actually have to live with it every day." In the end, the 1961 Pontiac Tempest Slant 4 remains a singularly ambitious, frustratingly flawed entry in American automotive history. A car that promised innovation, teased the future, but ultimately left a trail of vibration, broken crankshafts, and bemused drivers. The 1960 Renault Doufine occupies a strange, almost legendary place in American automotive history. A car that arrived with charm, promise, and a distinctly European flair, yet quickly earned a reputation for fragility, impracticality, and sheer unreliability. Renault, eager to expand its export market to the burgeoning post-war U.S. consumer base, positioned the Doufine as an affordable, stylish, and compact alternative to the massive, chrome-drenched sedans dominating American streets. Its rounded, almost cartoonish body, with gentle curves and an unthreatening demeanor, immediately caught the eye. It exuded a kind of playful friendliness, a stark contrast to the aggressive styling cues of contemporaneous Pontiacs, Fords, and Chevrolets. On first glance, the Doufine seemed perfect, small enough for city streets, economical enough to appeal to budget-conscious buyers, and striking enough to turn heads. Yet, beneath its cute exterior lurked a litany of design and engineering compromises that would make life miserable for anyone attempting to drive it as a daily car in the United States. At the heart of the Daufine's struggles was its diminutive 845cc four-cylinder engine, producing roughly 32 horsepower, sufficient only for meandering around town or short suburban jaunts. On flat roads and at slow speeds, the car was charmingly nimble. But as soon as it faced an incline, freeway traffic, or even an attempt at spirited acceleration, it revealed its limitations. Drivers quickly discovered that merging onto highways and traffic meant putting themselves and everyone else at risk, as the Doufine simply could not keep pace with other cars. Its suspension, tuned for European cobblestones rather than wide American asphalt, was soft and spongy, giving an unnerving floaty sensation at higher speeds, while the lightweight frame amplified every imperfection in the road. Steering was light, almost ethereal, which, coupled with the car's small wheelbase, made it feel skittish in crosswinds or during sudden maneuvers. The braking system, drum-only all around, required careful planning and constant vigilance, especially when attempting to stop from even modest speeds. Owners joked that driving a Doufine on American highways was a test of patience, nerve, and sometimes sheer luck. Where the Doufine truly earned its infamy, however, was in build quality and durability. Its unibody construction was thin and unprotected, leaving it almost guaranteed to rust rapidly, particularly in northern climates where road salt was used. Floors, wheel wells, and the lower body panels were especially vulnerable, and corrosion often appeared within months of purchase. It became a running joke that the Doufine was the car that dissolved, a nickname that stuck and has survived to this day. Replacement parts were scarce, service networks thin, and the expertise to maintain the delicate foreign mechanics difficult to find. Even routine repairs often required ingenuity, patience, and a willingness to cannibalize parts from other failing units. For many, owning a Doufine was less about transportation and more about constant vigilance and mechanical babysitting. Inside, the Daufine's tiny cabin was designed with efficiency in mind, but it came at a cost for comfort. Bench seating for four was cramped, the dashboard was minimalistic to the point of feeling sparse, and the controls, though logically laid out for a European car, seemed almost alien to American buyers accustomed to larger, more tactile interiors. Heating was marginal, ventilation rudimentary, and in winter months, the thin insulation compounded the problems of rusting floors and exposed underbody elements. Even the windows and doors, which might have been acceptable in France, felt flimsy and insecure by US standards. Long trips were uncomfortable, short trips nerve-wracking, and any attempt at spirited driving bordered on masochistic. Yet, despite its glaring flaws, the Doufine had certain redeeming qualities. Its diminutive size made city parking trivial, fuel economy was remarkable compared to anything American at the time, and its whimsical styling earned smiles and attention. It became a symbol of European elegance, efficiency, and simplicity, if one could overlook the constant mechanical and corrosion problems. Early adopters who loved the car's personality were often the ones who understood that owning a Doufine meant embracing its quirks, accepting frequent repairs, and tolerating its underwhelming performance. For the majority of US buyers, however, these small victories were not enough to overcome the relentless frustrations of underpowered engines, fragile construction, and the omnipresent threat of rust. Sales in America initially surged due to curiosity and low pricing, but the enthusiasm quickly evaporated. Negative word of mouth spread as owners shared horror stories of corroded floors, failed engines, and constant visits to mechanics unfamiliar with European engineering. By the mid-1960s, the Daufine's American reputation was firmly cemented. It was cute, it was cheap, but it was fundamentally unreliable and unsuitable for the realities of US driving. Owners' anecdotes captured the experience vividly. One recalled, "The Doufine looked like a toy car that belonged on a shelf, but when you drove it, you realized the shelf was on fire. It was charming, terrifying, and infuriating all at once." Another lamented, "You never knew if it would start in the morning, survive a rainstorm without leaking, or make it down the street without a puddle forming underneath." Despite these frustrations, some die-hard enthusiasts remained loyal, drawn to the car's distinct European character, nimble urban maneuverability, and the sheer absurdity of owning such a notorious little machine. Today, the 1960 Renault Doofine stands as a cautionary tale in automotive history. It is a car that promised accessible European style and economy for the American market, but delivered a perfect storm of underpowered performance, rust-prone construction, and delicate mechanical systems. Its legacy is one of contrasts, a vehicle that could delight the eye, frustrate the soul, and test the patience of anyone who dared to drive it. In the annals of imported American flops, few cars are remembered so vividly and for such thoroughly deserved reasons as the Doofine, the little French car that captured hearts, mocked expectations, and ultimately dissolved into automotive legend.
The 1960 Edsel Ranger is a study in how a brand can collapse under the weight of its own hype and initial missteps. A final chapter in a saga that had begun with so much fanfare and ended in bitter disappointment. By 1960, the Edsel name was already indelibly associated with failure, a cautionary tale repeated in automotive circles for decades. Ford's management, hoping to salvage something from the rubble of their misadventures, positioned the Ranger as a supposedly safe Edsel, a model that would cost less to produce, rely heavily on existing Ford components, and present a toned-down version of the brand's once controversial styling. Yet the approach proved far too little, too late. While the original 1958 Edsels had aimed for shock value, the 1960 Ranger seemed designed to offend no one, which in effect rendered it nearly invisible to buyers and media alike. The styling of the 1960 Ranger was as uninspired as it was cautious. Gone were the polarizing horse-collar grills and extravagant tail fins that had made the Edsel infamous. In their place was a conservative front end with subtle chrome trim and a gently rounded body that could be mistaken for any ordinary mid-tier Ford sedan on the road. To designers, it was a practical move. To the public, it was forgettable. The car had no standout features, no compelling design elements to draw attention in a crowded marketplace, and certainly none to erase the mental scar of the original Edsel debacle. Ford's attempt to sanitize the Edsel image paradoxically confirmed buyers' fears that the brand had nothing to offer beyond its tarnished name. Mechanically, the 1960 Ranger was entirely derivative of its Ford cousins, sharing engines, transmissions, and chassis with the contemporary Fairline and Falcon models. This meant that performance was competent but pedestrian. The six-cylinder and small V8 engines offered adequate acceleration and cruising ability, yet nothing in the driving experience suggested luxury or excitement. Reliability was generally sound, but in a market where perception often outweighed reality, these virtues were invisible. Even the car's handling and ride quality, which were acceptable for the era, were overshadowed by the stigma of the Edsel badge. The mere sight of it was enough to invite ridicule or hesitation from potential buyers. Dealers frequently reported that customers would approach a 1960 Ranger on the lot only to step away upon seeing the Edsel logo, choosing instead to purchase a visually similar Ford at nearly the same price. The marketing of the 1960 Ranger was muted to the point of near invisibility. Ford had learned bitter lessons from its extravagant, high-profile Edsel campaigns of 1957 to 1958, which had promised revolutionary styling and engineering that simply failed to deliver. In 1960, the company took a cautious, understated approach, emphasizing the Ranger's practicality and shared Ford components, rather than attempting to re-establish a distinctive Edsel identity. Dealers, left to fend for themselves, often had to invent their own sales pitches or avoid emphasizing the Edsel name entirely, highlighting instead the model's mechanical reliability or interior features.
In some cases, salespeople even went so far as to refer to the vehicle simply as a Ford Ranger, to avoid the stigma entirely. A sad testament to the power of negative branding in an era when brand perception could make or break a car instantly. Owners' experiences with the 1960 Ranger underscored the strange position the car occupied in automotive history. Driving it was technically unremarkable. The chassis was stable, the engine performed adequately, and the interior was serviceable for the era. Yet every journey carried a subtle psychological weight, a sense of embarrassment, a feeling that the world's automotive critics and neighbors alike were silently judging the choice. One owner remembered parking his Ranger next to a modern Chevrolet and feeling it was like trying to sneak a consolation prize into a beauty contest. Nobody cared about what was inside, they only saw the label. Another remarked that even friends who were loyal to Ford had a reflexive hesitation when the Edsel badge came into view, underscoring how deeply the brand's early failures had penetrated public consciousness. In effect, the Ranger became a car that could perform its intended function perfectly well, yet could not escape the shadow of its brand's infamous past. The production numbers of the 1960 Ranger were dramatically reduced compared to Ford's original forecasts for the Edsel brand. Dealers found themselves holding inventory for months, struggling to convince a skeptical public that this version of the Edsel was somehow different from the troubled 1958 to 1959 models. Unsold units were often deeply discounted, further undermining the vehicle's perceived value. By the end of the year, it was clear to Ford that the Edsel era was over. The brand was officially discontinued, leaving behind a small number of surviving 1960 Rangers. These cars, now rare, have become collectors' curiosities, not because they were desirable in their day, but because they represent a remarkable story of ambition, marketing hubris, and the consequences of public perception. In retrospect, the 1960 Edsel Ranger serves as both a cautionary tale and a historical artifact. It exemplifies how a brand, once damaged, cannot easily regain credibility, even when the underlying product is competent. The Ranger was reliable, adequately powered, and mechanically straightforward, yet it failed because of timing, perception, and the lingering memory of its parent brand's spectacular missteps. Collectors today prize the 1960 Ranger not for its performance or styling, which remain unremarkable, but for the story it tells about the fragility of automotive branding and the razor-thin line between ambition and disaster. In every surviving example, one can see the final echo of Edsel's ambitious but tragically flawed vision. A car built competently, yet forever haunted by its history, destined to be remembered not as a success, but as one of the most infamous failures in American automotive lore. The 1960 Edsel Ranger is ultimately a car defined by the weight of its context rather than the merits of its engineering or design. It is the final act of a brand that had promised to revolutionize the mid-market car segment only to collapse under the twin pressures of public expectation and marketing miscalculation. Every aspect of the Ranger, from its bland styling to its ordinary mechanics, is overshadowed by the story of the Edsel itself, a tale of ambition outpacing execution, of corporate misjudgment, and of the unforgiving nature of the consumer marketplace. Today, the Ranger stands as a reminder that in the automotive world, reputation can be far more powerful than reality, and that even a competent car can become legendary, but for all the wrong reasons.